Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that takes a dense stack of sources, articles, academic works, historical notes, and pulls out the essential, mind-bending insights so you can be instantly well-informed.
Today, we are plunging deep into the philosophical battlefield of the 19th century. Our focus is the complex, sometimes fraught relationship between the German idealist F.W.J. von Schelling and the intellectual giant who loomed over him, the 17th century radical rationalist Baruch Spinoza.
And this is more than just a historical review, right? It's a deep dive into this enduring tension in philosophy between idealism.
Right, the idea that reality is fundamentally mind-dependent.
And realism, which is the view that the world is just out there, completely independent of us.
Exactly. And our sources, which are, academic analyses of these two thinkers, they lay out Schelling's monumental mission. He didn't just want to write another philosophy. He wanted to build a complete systematic worldview.
A system that would do what exactly?
A system that would actively avoid what he saw as the two catastrophic outcomes of modern thought.
Okay, so what were these two catastrophes?
Well, on one side, you had the madness of pure idealism. Think of some of his predecessors. This view, it kind of reduces everything to just a subjective projection of the mind.
And the other side?
The likelessness of pure realism, which he felt was the inevitable endpoint of Spinoza's system.
So Schelling's whole goal was to build something that could reconcile the two.
Precisely. To build a system that could reconcile the identity of the absolute, that singular source of all existence, with the reality of, the messy, living, different world that we all actually experience.
That sounds like a tightrope walk over a philosophical abyss. I mean, if the absolute is literally everything, how can anything be distinct and alive within it?
That is the central problem of this whole deep dive. Yeah. And the core concept that Schelling developed to pull this off is his notion of ideal-realism, or in the original German, ideal-realismus.
Ideal-realism. It's a conjunction of these two terms that are usually opposite.
And they're bound, crucially, by a very deliberate hyphen.
Okay, let's focus on that hyphen, because that seems to be doing some serious intellectual heavy lifting here.
It absolutely is. I mean, in traditional philosophy, you have to pick a side. Are you an idealist or are you a realist? They're mutually exclusive.
Right.
Schelling's hyphen signifies a unity that is, at the same time, dependent upon both binding the two terms together and keeping them separate.
So neither one is complete on its own?
Exactly. A complete systematic philosophy for Schelling can't be just idealism, which he saw as incomplete, nor can it be just realism, which he saw as lifeless. They're the only two possible consistent views, and yet neither one works without the other.
That feels almost paradoxical. How can two systems that define reality in completely opposite ways both be necessary for one true system?
Well, they're necessary because they represent the two sides of the absolute itself. Yeah. The ideal, which you can think of as thought or mind or the subject.
And the real. Extension, nature, the object.
Exactly. And Schelling establishes this really profound metaphysical equivalence between them. It's foundational to his whole system. He actually takes a phrase from Kant's later work.
The opus posthumum.
Yes, where Kant says that transcendental idealism is realism in an absolute sense. Schelling takes that and just runs with it, building this transitive relationship.
Okay, let's unpack that for a second. Kant, the father of transcendental idealism, is calling his own system realism in an absolute sense. Why on earth would he use that term?
Well, because even though transcendental idealism says that objects conform to our way of knowing them, it also, it asserts the existence of the thing in itself, something that is ultimately independent of our minds.
So Kant's idealism is actually supposed to secure our everyday empirical realism.
That's the goal. And Schelling takes this idea and extends the chain. He says, realism in an absolute sense equals transcendental idealism, which in turn equals his own ideal realism.
And all of that leads to his really bold claim of absolute realism.
Precisely. And absolute realism isn't just, a more enthusiastic version of realism. That's not it at all.
So what is it?
In Schelling's hands, it's a metaphysical system where the identity of identity and non-identity, what he and Hegel called the absolute, is defined as real. It is materially actual, not just a concept we cooked up in our heads.
So it's a kind of anti-idealism that uses the structure and rigor of idealism to make sure the final system is, well, absolute.
You've got it. The complex structure of the absolute, its dynamic nature, its internal fights, its contradictions, all of that has to be ontologically real. It has to exist independently of the philosopher thinking about it.
Which is the exact opposite of what Jacobi was so afraid of.
The exact opposite. Jacobi feared this identity that was only established inside the subjective self. Schelling wanted to find it out there, in the real.
All right, let's unpack this then. Before we can really get into Schelling's solution, we have to understand the problem he inherited. The sources really stress that Spinoza's system, which came to these really radical conclusions, wasn't actually driven by a desire for monism itself.
No, not primarily. It was driven by something much more fundamental, much more uncompromising, a militant commitment to rationalism.
That is the essential starting point, then, Spinoza's militant rationalism.
It is. It's the key to understanding him and why he became this great philosophical foil for the whole German idealist movement. Spinoza's entire project is just this unflinching adherence to the principle of sufficient reason, the PSR.
Can you just remind us of the PSR in, simple terms?
Sure. The PSR basically asserts two things. First, everything must have a cause, a reason for being the way it is. Nothing is arbitrary.
Okay.
And second, every single causal relation in the universe must be necessarily intelligently reasoned. There's a complete explanation for literally everything.
And Spinoza, unlike a lot of other philosophers, he just refused to put any limits on that.
No limits whatsoever. He believed that if something exists, it must be capable of being completely understood by reason alone. No mystery, no faith, just pure reason.
And if you follow that principle with absolute militant rigor, where does it take you?
It leads you inexorably to monism. If you accept the PSR and refuse to limit it, you are forced to conclude that only one thing truly exists.
Why? Why does it force that conclusion?
Well, think about it. If there were two or more truly distinct, independent things, let's call them thing A and thing B, you would need an explicable reason why they're divided.
Right. Why is A not B? What separates them?
Exactly. And if they're fundamentally separate, then neither can fully explain the other, which violates the PSR. Therefore, they can't actually be separate. They must just be modifications of a single underlying substance.
So for Spinoza, monism isn't the starting point. It's the logical conclusion of pure reason.
It's completely derivative of reason's demand for total intelligibility.
This brings us to what the source material calls the most monstrous thought, which is, I have to say, a very powerful phrase for a philosophy text.
It is. And it's the stark, uncompromising conclusion of his whole system. Only one thing truly exists, and that single substance is God or nature. Deus of natura.
So any multiplicity we perceive, the distinction between a table and a chair, you and me,
Is at best illusory. Or, in the most severe philosophical judgment, it's nonsense bordering on madness.
So Spinoza isn't just saying that everything depends on the one big whole. That would be, what, priority monism?
Correct. He's not a priority monist, he's an existence monist. He's saying that the distinct, finite things we see around us don't really exist at all as independent things.
So the universe isn't made of building blocks that assemble into a whole.
No. The whole is absolutely prior to any parts. You can almost visualize Spinoza's world not as a structured object, but as a single, indivisible blobject.
A blobject. I like that.
It's ontologically simple, it's just one thing, but it has this enormous structural complexity. Think of a vast, infinitely complex fractal pattern.
Okay.
The complexity is staggering, but the entire pattern is just generated by one simple rule applied over and over. It might look diverse, but it's really just one thing.
So if all that complexity is just, variability within the one substance, what does that make us, the observers, the finite particulars?
It makes us merely things of reason, or, to use his harsher terms, mutilated and confused perceptions.
Wow.
Our sense of being an individual, of being distinct, it's just a mistake. It's a representation that comes from an ill-attuned and poorly directed mind that mistakenly thinks individual appearances are objectively real.
So all the complexity we map out in science and in our daily lives, it doesn't actually correspond to any real division in the underlying reality.
Not at all. It's all just substance.
And this radical rationalism, unsurprisingly, it immediately created a crisis among other philosophers, most famously F.H. Jacobi.
Oh, yes. Jacobi became this great intellectual firebrand, this philosophical culture warrior.
Yeah.
He insisted that Spinoza's rationalism, when you take it to its logical end, just destroys freedom, reality, morality, everything.
He framed the whole crisis as this inescapable choice between realism and idealism.
He did. And he accused the transcendental idealists, like Fichte, of basically creating a new inverted Spinozism. He called it madness and nihilism.
So what was his core fear? What was the big problem?
His core fear was the principle of immanence, the idea that reality is contained entirely within something.
Whether it's the thinking subject, like in Fichte, or the single substance, like in Spinoza.
Exactly. Either way, the system becomes closed. It becomes self-referential. And Jacobi argued that these closed systems, they inevitably relate to nothing outside of these closed systems.
They become vacuums of meaning.
Vacuums of meaning, far from any objective external reality. And that, for him, is the definition of nihilism, the dissolution of real objective meaning.
It sounds like the philosopher gets locked inside their own head, trapped by their own perfect logic.
That's a perfect way to put it. Jacobi insisted that for genuine knowledge, for truth about God, nature, and ourselves, you need an infinite difference between the finite human word or thought and the infinite external thing it refers to.
So if you collapse that difference, which both Spinoza and Fichte seem to do,
you eliminate externality. You eliminate truth itself.
So how does Jacobi propose we break out of this rational prison? If reason leads you straight to this dead end, the solution can't be more reason.
No, and his solution wasn't irrationalism either. It was a deeply felt existential grounding, a fideistic realism.
Fideistic realism, meaning based on faith?
Yes, but a specific kind. He acknowledged that if you only use pure theoretical reason, Spinozism will always look like the most consistent, most rigorous conclusion. So to overcome it, you have to use a non-theoretical act.
The famous salto mortale, the death-defying leap.
Correct. The leap is this necessary non-theoretical act you have to take to bypass the rationalist trap. It's a conceptual ascent, but it's grounded not in an argument or proof, but in a non-conceptual, immediate feeling or conviction.
An extra-rational faith.
Right. A faith that establishes an absolute relation to the absolute without trying to logically contain it or define it or fit it into a system.
I think the listener needs to understand why this isn't just, giving up on philosophy. If you just leap back into the real world through faith, how is that a philosophical solution?
Because it forces a restriction on the universal reach of the PSR. Jacobi's leap is a leap back into the real, lower world of action and experience. And in doing so, it affirms the independence thesis.
The crucial realist claim that the actuality of objects is independent of our minds.
Yes. For Jacobi, faith is the way you access this immediate, living reality. And by doing that, you ground philosophy in something external, and you save it from the self-destructiveness of totalizing reason.
So it's like saying, I believe in the external world not because I can prove it, but because I have to live in it.
That's it, exactly. And this leap is so vital because it basically sets the stakes for all of the German idealism that comes after, including, of course, Schelling's project.
Now, Jacobi's critique, it found a more systematic voice in Kant, right? Even though Jacobi was against Kant's idealism, they both had this deep suspicion of Spinoza.
They did. Kant basically took Jacobi's concerns and systematized them in the Critique of Pure Reason, in the section on the antinomies. He showed the internal self-contradictory limits of reason when it tries to go beyond the bounds of possible experience.
And what were the consequences if Kant failed to dismantle Spinoza?
The stakes, as Kant saw them, were cosmic. He argued that if Spinoza's transcendental realism couldn't be neutralized, if we keep mistaking the objects of our experience for things in themselves, then neither nature nor freedom would remain.
So to save freedom and the whole moral law, he had to rein in the PSR.
He had to curtail its constitutive application. Reason can seek totality, but it can't just assume that totality is objectively given to it in experience.
This brings us to the antinomies, especially the first and third. But our sources suggest that Spinoza's system, paradoxically, kind of dodges Kant's critique. How?
This is a really crucial, subtle point. Kant sets up the antinomies by treating the world as a totum syntheticum.
A totality that's built up sequentially from parts, like adding up moments in time.
Right. And Kant says reason demands we complete this infinite series, which is the antithesis, but experience demands we have a starting point, which is the thesis, and you get a contradiction.
But Spinoza doesn't see the world that way at all.
Not at all. For Spinoza, the world is a totum analyticum. It's a totality that is given immediately and entirely independent of its parts. Since reason for him is guided only by the PSR, he just says reason demands complete infinity. And who cares about conflicting sensory experience?
So because Spinoza's world is a single, indivisible entity to begin with, The whole conflict between finite and infinite just dissolves.
It dissolves. Kant is attacking a world made of sequential parts, but Spinoza's world is a single infinite whole that comes before any parts. So the antinomies just don't get a grip on them.
And what about the third antinomy, the one about necessity versus freedom?
Spinoza sides completely with the antithesis. Everything happens solely according to nature's laws. There is no absolute spontaneity, no freedom. So Spinozism remains this intellectually rigorous rival that actually survives Kant's critique.
So if Spinozism is this legitimate theoretical alternative that pure reason can't destroy, how does Kant manage to assert the necessity of freedom? Where does he win?
The resolution, and this is so important for Schelling, lies in the practical realm. Kant basically insists that theoretical reason, which leads you to Spinoza's necessity, cannot override the evidence of our practical reason, our moral imperative.
So as moral agents, we can't escape the feeling that we are free and self-determining.
Exactly. So in essence, we have to choose to prioritize our moral life over the theoretical consistency of Spinoza's universe.
We put up with reason's impossible demands because of a prior commitment to act freely.
That's it. We seek to understand the world's necessity. It is, in order to change it in accordance with what it ought to be, our freedom. And this practical turn is the intellectual backdrop against which Schelling has to build his entire system.
Okay, so Schelling enters this scene. He sees this huge fight between criticism, which is idealism, and dogmatism, which is realism. He sees them as the only two possible systems, but they're both fundamentally incomplete on their own.
Right. And he went looking for the common root from which both of them must necessarily spring.
So his goal was a unified system where idealism and realism are connected, but neither one reduces the other.
That was the goal. But he saw this core philosophical dilemma, which he called the tragic fate of theoretical reason.
The tragic fate, what does that mean?
The tragedy is that the ultimate quest of reason, defined the absolute, the unconditioned foundation of everything, it always tends to destroy the very opposition that makes knowledge possible in the first place.
The subject-object split.
Exactly. If you find the absolute, you risk dissolving that split, and then you're right back in Spinoza's static monism or Fichte's subjective vacuum. The whole system just collapses the moment the root is found.
So how did Schelling initially try to bridge that gap without making everything collapse?
Well, his initial appeal, especially in his early writings, was to something he called productive intellectual intuition, or creative reason.
Okay, what is that?
It was conceived as this nonsensible internal act, where the will, through self-reflection, could somehow create its own object from nothing. This act of the mind generating the object it knows created a sublime and perpetual striving, which kept the ideal and the real dynamically alive.
But that sounds a lot like Fichte's philosophy, and Jacobi had already called that subjective madness. Did Schelling manage to avoid that trap?
Not at first, according to the sources. His early letters admitted that the opposition between the systems was held together pragmatically.
Meaning it was all happening inside the philosopher's head.
Exactly. The philosopher, by realizing the system within oneself, becomes the place where the real and the ideal meet. And that suggests the identity is established by the knower's consciousness, which is precisely the subjectivism he needed to overcome.
So if the solution has to be objective, he has to move away from the individual philosopher and towards some kind of foundational metaphysical principle.
Yes, and this leads him to his next big step, the identity philosophy. He moved toward a comprehensive monism, but one that was built on a structure that was fundamentally different from Spinoza's seamless substance. He started with the necessity of an absolute being, arguing that to be determinate, a thing relies on a being that can be thought through itself alone. This leads him to the fundamental law of identity, 1ML.
But wait, Spinoza would agree with Anhas. What's the critical difference here that makes Schelling's absolute dynamic and not static?
The twist. The twist is the explicit integration of difference into the very definition of the absolute identity itself.
So for Spinoza, identity is simple, seamless, it excludes difference.
Yes. For Schelling, the absolute is defined not just as identity, but as the identity of identity in opposition, or the identity of the self-identical and the non-identical.
So what does that complex definition tell us about the absolute?
It tells us that the absolute is not serene. It's not peaceful. It is intrinsically dynamic and internally conflicted. Reason, therefore, is not just simple, strict rationality, because the absolute itself contains both the purely rational, which is identity, and the irrational, the differentiating principle, which is non-identity.
So identity itself becomes complex.
It becomes a gathering of distinct terms and functions. You have The subject, the predicate, and the copula. It is.
Can you just illustrate how that structure, subject, predicate, copula, guarantees that there's opposition inside the absolute?
Sure. Think about the statement, the absolute is identity. The subject absolute is supposed to be identical to the predicate identity. But the copula, the word is, performs the act of relating two terms that have to be, even just for a moment, separated for that relation to even be meaningful.
Okay, I see.
This internal structure demands what's called a disjunctive relation, a reciprocal causation, a dynamic tension. It's analogous to the dynamic of organic life. If other dollars were just other dollar in a simple static way, it would just be a single point with no internal life, which is the problem with Spinoza.
Schelling's definition makes sure the absolute is a process.
A process of identifying and differentiating, yes.
And this complexity is what's needed to solve the problem of finitude. If only one dynamic absolute really exists, how does Schelling explain the individual objects we experience, our tables, our chairs, without just calling them illusions, like Spinoza did?
Right, he can't afford that reduction. He's trying to build absolute realism, so he needs the finite particulars to be not entirely unreal. They have to have some objective connection to the absolute.
So how does he manage that connection without breaking the monomism?
He redefines the nature of finitude itself. Schelling defines the determination of things, their being specific in space and time, as a negation of existence, or a quantitative partial erasure of the absolute.
A quantitative erasure, that's a sophisticated way of saying not quite existing. So if finitude is defined by what it lacks, how does that keep it connected to the absolute?
The connection is maintained because the negation is partial and quantitative, not a complete qualitative break. Think of it like a light source. The infinite, the absolute, is the light.
Okay.
Determinate finite things are the shadows cast by that light. They exist as specific forms insofar as they lack the totality of the light.
So a thing is defined by what it's not.
In a way, yes. The key insight is paradoxical. Things exist as determinate things insofar as they do not exist. Their existence is a kind of relative non-being. And conversely, the infinite exists precisely because it is not a specific determinate thing. It's not limited.
So this distinction, determination as partial non-being, it creates a sort of controlled crack in Spinoza's simple identity.
It does. It allows for real differentiation and complexity in the world without requiring an actual ontological division of the one substance.
Okay, so now we can get to the heart of the critique of Spinoza. Schelling argues that even if Spinoza's substance is ultimately one, the way he structured its relation to the world, through the famous doctrine of attribute parallelism, it renders the whole system dead, lifeless.
That is the central charge. And the lifelessness stems directly from that famous line in Spinoza, EII P7. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things.
Right, the parallelism. It governs the relationship between the attributes, which are mainly thought, the ideal, and extension, the real.
Yes, and we often hear the analogy that the attributes are like two mirrors perfectly reflecting the same single reality.
Yeah, what's wrong with that analogy for Schelling?
The problem is that Spinoza defines the attributes as conceptually and causally independent. He says each attribute of one substance must be conceived through itself.
Okay.
Schelling argues that if the attributes are genuinely self-contained, and one can't limit or interact with the other, then they're just parallel lines that never intersect.
So they run in perfect sync, but they never touch.
They never touch. And despite the unity of the underlying substance, the parallelism itself functionally ruins that unity.
And if they never intersect, you kill the possibility of life.
Precisely. Life, for Schelling, requires conflict, striving, interpenetration. A static parallel relation forbids that necessary intersection or interpenetration of attributes. The identity of the real and the ideal must not erase their simultaneous non-identity. They have to be distinct enough to struggle with each other.
So if they just run side by side, perfectly matching, the conflict necessary for a dynamic, living world is just gone.
It's gone. You're left with a static, serene, and ultimately dead absolute. Schelling's absolute has to be intrinsically dynamic. It has to be involved in an internal conflict.
It's like the inverse of the subjectivism problem. Instead of being too subjective, Spinoza is too objective, too perfect, and therefore just inert.
That's the diagnosis. What's more, the parallelism doctrine creates what our sources call the bifurcation problem.
Okay, what's that?
Well, Spinoza's militant naturalism requires that there be no illegitimate bifurcations in reality. Everything has to be explicable by the PSR. So if the attributes of thought and extension are genuinely distinct and independent.
Then you have to explain where that distinction, that bifurcation came from.
Exactly. Where is the explicable reason for their split from the singular seamless substance? If you appeal to some third thing to explain the division, you immediately violate the PSR, which says substance has to be conceived through itself alone.
So the parallelism, which was supposed to show the unity of substance, actually exposes this huge conceptual gap.
A huge philosophical vulnerability that Schelling just completely exploited.
So Schelling needed a dynamic idealism to bring realism to life, one that would let the ideal and the real actually interact, not just run in parallel. How did he structure that?
He did it by contrasting his system with what he saw as the reductive tendency in figures like Fichte. Fichte's system, which is sometimes called eliminative idealism or inverted Spinozism, was, in Schelling's view, fatally flawed.
What was Fichte's big error?
Fichte basically confined the real-ideal division solely within consciousness, within the subjective I. The world, nature, the non-I, it gets reduced to a phantom. It's just an object that the I posits for the sole purpose of achieving self-consciousness.
So for Fichte, nature is just a projection.
It's a one-sided reduction that fails the test of absolute realism, which requires the real and ideal to be actual, objective self-determinations of the absolute, not just mental projections. Fichte's one-sidedness leads you right back to Jacobi's fear of a closed, self-referential system.
And this is where Schelling positions his own approach as ampliative idealism.
Yes, idealism for Schelling is fundamentally ampliative. It's not about reducing reality to mind. It's about increasing reality, making all things more than what they once were.
So it's a process, the dynamic act of creative reason.
Right. It's the process through which the ideal actualizes itself in the real, and reciprocally, the real actualizes itself through the ideal. The idea isn't some static blueprint. It's a dynamic function that causes organization, growth, change, and opposition.
So instead of the idea just reflecting the real, like in Spinoza, or reducing the real to a mental construct, like in Fichte, the ideal and the real are in this continuous productive tension.
Precisely. And we see this dynamic most clearly in Schelling's concept of spirit in the treatise Explicatory. Spirit is defined as infinite activity, eternal becoming. It comes to know itself as finite by the very act of producing that finitude.
So it's a unity of activity and product?
Yes, constantly striving to present the infinite within the finite, and the finite struggling against its own limits to reflect the infinite. This mechanism of self-production and self-opposition, it guarantees the conflict and striving that's necessary for life, and that fundamentally breaks the static, lifeless nature of Spinoza's parallelism.
So to succeed where Spinoza failed, Schelling realized he had to completely redefine the absolute. It couldn't be a serene, seamless substance. It had to be a process, a history, a struggle.
Yes, and this required him to tackle what he called the true mysteries of philosophy, the eternal birth of things and their painful relationship to the divine.
And this search for a non-static beginning led him to draw a really radical ontological conclusion from Kant's epistemology.
That's the key transition. Kant's antinomies showed that the world, theoretically, does not exist in itself. It's neither finitely bounded nor infinitely completed. Most Kantians like Schelling took this finding, that reason can't fully grasp the world as a complete whole, and concluded that reality itself is intrinsically flawed.
Wait, so the flaw isn't in our perception, the flaw is in being itself.
The flaw is in being.
Wow.
The system is structurally incomplete from the very start. It's a broken whole, a fractured unity.
So being is shot through with antagonisms and tensions, riddled with cracks, fissures, and gaps.
That's the essential ontological incompleteness of the world. It's often termed nature's own Ohnmacht, its impotence, its weakness.
And that weakness, that flaw in the absolute, that's somehow a good thing.
It is the absolute condition of possibility for us. If being were a monolithic, seamless whole, a perfect Spinozist blobject, there would be no space, no gap for the emergence of denaturalized, more than material subjectivity.
Which is us, human consciousness and freedom.
We exist because the absolute is incomplete and struggling.
This immediately raises the question of the divine. If the flaw is in the source of all being, then God is struggling. We're dealing with a suffering God, a God that is not well. We're talking about divine pain.
The divine pain, for Schelling, is essential, not accidental. It's characterized by an uneasiness with oneself, an inner antagonism between unity and duality that has to exist before the world is even created. The absolute is internally divided, experiencing this conflict between its infinite potential and its need to actualize itself finitely.
So how does this divine discomfort become the mechanism that actually creates difference? We already established it can't be division or the unity is lost.
The mechanism is self-doubling and intussusception. The emergence of difference from identity is made possible by the doubling of identity. And crucially, this doubling results in an intensification of identity, not a negation or cancellation of it, which is the mechanism Hegel would later call Aufhebung.
Let's get into intussusception. That sounds like something you'd find in a biology textbook.
It is. Schelling uses this term, intussusception, which means growth from within, but it also carries this medical analogy of an organ folding over on itself, causing pain, obstruction, contortion.
That's a powerful, really visceral image for God.
It is. The absolute, in its attempt to fully realize its own identity, falls into itself. It contorts, it twists, it doubles over.
And the world is the painful outcome of God's self-contortion.
In a sense, yes. This intense self-affection forces the expulsion of the world and the logical constraints that make rational knowledge possible. The God who is entrapped in being, the absolute struggling within itself, posits a second personality, a second dimension of reality.
And this happens not by dividing or separating, which Spinoza was so afraid of.
But by remaining whole and doubling over. And this doubling creates the necessary, essential conflict that drives all existence, breaking the mold of static monism for good.
And that dynamic rupture at the heart of the absolute is then mirrored directly in the human being.
It is. Human freedom isn't some abstract, unconditioned state that's granted from the outside. It is a localized expression, a repetition of the absolute's own rupture and internal conflict.
So Schelling is basically inverting Spinoza.
He's inverting Spinoza. Spinoza started with absolute necessity, with pantheism, and he couldn't get to freedom. Schelling starts with freedom, the necessary self-cause, and seeks to arrive at the conclusion that pantheism, in this complex, dynamic sense, is true.
And this internal divine conflict has to be reflected in the structure of human consciousness, which Schelling calls the tripartite human spirit. This seems like his final answer to Spinoza's static parallelism.
It is. The human spirit has to be structured to coordinate its own internal madness, its own reflection of the absolute struggle, and that requires a complex middle ground.
Okay, walk us through the three powers of the human spirit.
So the first power is temperament, the German Gemüth. This represents the real principle. This is the realm where the spirit faces the real world it can't free itself from. It contains nostalgia, the pull of the past, and desire, the thrust toward the future.
And its highest expression
Is feeling, Gefühl. Feeling is the dark, receptive, grounding principle that stands between the pull of non-being and the thrust of being. It balances those deep forces.
So feeling here is not just emotion, it's the metaphysical anchor to the real.
Exactly. The second power is l'esprit, which is personality, or the middle ground. This is the conscious power of will and understanding, where the individual is free to configure the relationship between the real and the ideal. And crucially, the understanding isn't opposed to the will, it's a manifestation of it.
And the final, highest power.
That is the soul, the ideal, the impersonal. This is the properly divine in man, something impersonal that the personality has to submit to. The soul isn't individual knowledge, it is science itself and goodness itself, its absolute form.
And reason, then, is?
The reason, for Schelling, is defined as the understanding in submission to the soul, the individual will submitting to the impersonal, absolute form.
So if Spinoza's system failed because thought and extension were just parallel, how does Schelling's tripartite spirit solve that problem in the human realm?
Because philosophy itself, the true expression of the absolute in us, arises from the dynamic function of the soul, specifically through the living interpenetration and the messy, reciprocally determining relation between feeling, that dark principle of temperament, and the soul, the absolute form.
So the dynamic is messy and reciprocal. The rational structure, the soul, has to interact with the brute, receptive fact of existence, which is feeling, to create knowledge, and vice versa.
Precisely. The two principles are constantly limiting and determining each other. Feeling grounds the rational structure in reality, so it doesn't become a subjective phantom, and the soul organizes the brute material of feeling so it doesn't become just chaos.
And Spinoza's parallelism makes that dynamic, messy unity impossible because the attributes can never touch.
They can never interact. Schelling's model insists that this internal conflict and interpenetration is the only way you can achieve systematicity, life, and genuine knowledge.
What an incredible journey through metaphysical tension. So Schelling's ideal realism, bound by that necessary hyphen, it succeeds by maintaining the essential conflict between idealism and realism.
Yes, he moves past Spinoza's static monism and lifeless parallelism by realizing that conflict and difference, they aren't accidental flaws. They're real, and they're born from the inner rupture and the doubling of the absolute itself.
The core philosophical shift feels monumental.
It is. For Schelling, the existence of a coherent world of spirit and nature, it occurs with each other through a shared, ongoing process. The intelligibility of spirit doesn't require the erasure of the natural. The natural is a necessary part of the divine self-realization.
So the unity is dynamic. It's a living interpenetration.
Where their continuous separating is called an eternal scission, a beginning that never ceases to begin.
That internally conflicted, dynamically unified absolute is the total antithesis of Spinoza's serene substance. It introduces pain and struggle right into the heart of reality.
Absolutely. And this leads us to our provocative thought for you, the listener, the person trying to synthesize the world. Schelling argues that the profoundest essence of the human soul requires meeting four simultaneous contradictory demands. Those of the spirit, the heart, moral feeling, and most rigorous understanding.
And to achieve this coordination, which is necessary for satisfaction and truth,
we must actively coordinate what he explicitly calls madness.
So if philosophy, this inner art of dialogue, this constant struggle between what is known and what is felt, is merely the shadow or afterimage of the absolute's own necessary self-doubling, what specific internal conflicts must you embrace and coordinate to become, in Schelling's grand language, an organ of the system of the world?
Consider the tension you feel between your rational thought and your immediate non-conceptual feeling. That pain, that doubling, Schelling suggests, is not a distraction from knowledge. It is the pathway to true knowledge in life.
Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.